Hello, welcome back to the videos for the introduction to programming in GIS using Python with ArcGIS Pro, job 453, 651. In the first set of chapters that we have seen thus far, the different patterns that Python is looking for, as well of regular statements, complex or compound statements, functions, objects with their properties and methods. Then we have seen, okay, how do you start stepping through and reading through code? In that example, in that chapter, chapter 5, reading through code, we were stepping through and using and looking at code that worked. In a practical setting, in practice, you would be far more likely to be stepping through code that doesn't work. You have all by now, I am sure, encountered code that doesn't work. Maybe you forgot a colon or a comma. So you missed a delimiter and you got an error. Or you used the wrong variable and you got an error. Or something didn't work. It ran, you didn't get an error, but it gave you the wrong answer. And in all of these situations, you would want to go through line by line to try to figure out exactly where the error is so that you can fix it. That is the focus of this chapter. And it will wrap up the first segment of the course on general Python principles or programming principles before we move to Arc Pro specific topics after the exam. So stepping through and debugging our code, first off, there are 3 general categories of errors that we can encounter in Python and really in any programming environment, any programming language. The first of these is syntax errors. So with a syntax error, we have seen the term syntax, and we've seen plenty of syntax errors, in, I'm sure, as you have gone through. It is where, if you think back to those patterns, it is where the line of code or the block of code for a complex statement or a condition, like a conditional statement or a loop, doesn't fit the pattern that Python is looking for. And so, in a sense, the computer, because it has no common sense, cannot figure out what you were trying to tell it to do. It cannot actually read the line of code, and so it says there's a syntax error. It will try to help in many cases to give you some information as to what the nature of the problem might be. However, these error messages, as you have seen and as you will continue to see, are basically written by computer scientists in the language of computer science, which doesn't normally help people. Like, I know at least one person sent me screen captures with a syntax error that said EOF or EOL, saying end of file or end of line. That translates to where it says it got to the end of a line and it didn't get everything it was expecting to find. That usually means something is missing at the end of a line. A quote mark at the end of a string. A parenthesis at the end of calling a function. A colon at the end of an if or def line. Something is missing and it therefore doesn't fit the pattern, and that makes it a syntax error. When we go through and we are debugging, as we will see in the remaining video or videos for this topic, the first set of errors that we will be fixing are the syntax errors. And it will present them basically in appearance, from start to finish. Once we get everything matching a pattern, then we would typically move on to the next kind of error that we will encounter when we are trying to debug a piece of code. That being a runtime error. So when a runtime error, a pattern is matched, it can have the syntax that it is looking for. However, when it actually goes and tries to carry out the instruction, it comes across a problem. So the problem arises at the time the code is run, therefore it is a runtime error. Some common examples of this could be if you're doing a conditional statement and you say, if x equals false. Well, no, that would be, and x is not Boolean, you might have a problem. You could have a type error. Another kind of type error that's even more common is if you're trying to, as in one of the earlier exercises I told you to do it so that you got a sense of error messages and didn't panic when you see them, adding a number to a string. If you're trying to add, basically if you're trying to add two different types of things and you say x plus y, the computer, when it is running the syntax, recognizes x plus y. This is addition, this is fine. But then it goes to run it, and that's when it realizes, oh, x is a number, but y isn't. It recognizes what you are trying to accomplish, but it cannot do it. That is when there is a runtime error. And it will still not be able to run the code. You will still get some kind of error message. It may be a type error, it may be a divide by zero error where x divided by y. Even if they're both numbers, that's probably fine, unless y happens to equal 0. Then you have a problem. So again, it knows what you're trying to do, but it cannot carry out that code or execute that line for some reason. The last type of error that you will encounter, and again, as you're going through the code, first you fix all the syntax errors, then you fix all the runtime errors. Then you get the code to a point where it will run. It will actually go through start to finish and do stuff. But you still have to watch out for this third, trickiest kind of error, the logical error. So in a logical error, the code runs, it executes, it gives you an answer. It's just not necessarily the answer you want. So you might have, say, a typo in, if you're trying to add, if you want to add two things, but you tell it to subtract instead. Instead of having x plus y, you put in x minus y. It will run, it will give you an answer, just not the one you want. Those can be the hardest ones to track down because there's no error message. There is no attempt at the program's part, or the computer's part, to tell you, I found an error on line 5. There's no error message, so it won't tell you there's an error on line 5, even if there is, and it is a logical error. Another note on the, when it tells you there's an error on line 5, especially if you're working with runtime errors. The line is given as when the computer realizes there's a problem. So for example, if you have x plus y, and y you set up as taking the previous example from the code, y equals, in quotes, $500. Where you really wanted it just to be y equals 500. So you made it a string instead of a number, and then when you go to divide by 2, you get a problem. You get an error message. The code will tell you there's a runtime error on the line that divides y by 2, or divides the price by 2. That's when it discovered the error. That doesn't mean that's where the error is. The error actually occurred, and the fix needs to take place earlier in the code when you say price equals $500 instead of price equals 500. So especially for runtime errors, when it tells you here's the number of the line that it is on, that's when the computer discovered the error, not necessarily where you need to look to fix the error. But again, we will see more examples of that and more on that later in other videos when we look at an example stepping through. There are going to be demos showing you examples of these 3 kinds of errors. So just to recap, these 3 kinds of errors, the first ones that you will have to fix are the syntax errors. Those are when the code does not match any pattern. It's a grammatical mistake. It may mean a delimiter is missing or something like that. And you need to fix basically some typo in the code. The second type are runtime errors, which the computer can figure out what you're trying to tell it. It can match the syntax to one of the patterns it's looking for. But when it comes time to carry out the code, it cannot figure anything out. And it comes up with a problem, like dividing by 0. And the third kind of error, which will be the last ones you'll have to fix, after all the syntax errors and the runtime errors are done and the code runs, but then it gives you the wrong answer. You were expecting a list of names and it gave you an empty list, for example. You need to then figure out, okay, now I need to do some detective work to figure out why is my list empty. Okay, I actually forgot to include the append statement, for example. So, okay, now I know where the problem is, and I can fix it. But you'll have to do some detective work to figure out why you are having the logical errors. So that wraps up this introduction to the different types of errors that we can see. And coming up next will be demos using idle, showing you the debugger in idle, as well as examples of these kinds of errors. So again, thank you for watching, and I will see you at the next video.